Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm editor-in-chief of RCR Wireless News. Thanks for joining us today. Today I am joined by longtime industry analyst Roger Entner, who is currently, he's founder and lead analyst at Recon Analytics, but has been around the telecom space for longer than most of us have. So Roger, definitely appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me back, Dan.
Great. Well, today I'm hoping to talk a bit about the exciting, or at least to be exciting, spectrum auction. Now, obviously, the FCC right now is still finishing up or attempting to finish up auction 97, which is the auction of some AWS3 or the 1.7, 2.1 gigahertz spectrum. The auction has been a wild success, I think most would say. Right now, more than $44 billion bid for the potential winning bids. But I want to talk a bit with Roger about, I guess, the impact and the importance that this auction, I guess, shows for the spectrum. And obviously, I think there was expectations for the auction, but obviously what's happened has shown that this spectrum is much more valuable than realized or thought initially. I guess get some insight into why that is and perhaps the importance of the spectrum in the overall scheme of the domestic market. So I guess just general insight on your general view of the auction and I guess the success of it so far.
Well, I think everybody's blown away by 45 billion plus. It's I think realistically we were looking at 25 billion or so, which would have still blown the old record away of 19.8 billion. But the 45 billion is quite the statement that and it's action rather than words of the wireless industry. I remember, when was it, at CTIA where Chairman Wheeler came out and basically said, if you don't show up to my next auction and don't bid, you're not going to get more. Did they come? And they came with full coffers. What makes this auction very, very interesting is, AWS3. This is the global band. LTE has more than 50 bands, and handset manufacturers and carriers are puzzling in which weird permutation they should put the 4 or 5 different bands together in their phone to make it possible that their customers can roam internationally. And that roaming revenue can come to this country because nobody wants to have that their customer travels overseas and they are hobbled by very slow connectivity. And so the huge importance, what makes this spectrum so appealing is that it will work globally. So this is the one band that basically every higher end phone that will be sold in the world will have. And so that makes it very valuable. Some of the other pundits have pointed out that this is a testament of how secure the wireless industry feels in its future, and that Title II doesn't matter, and that they will spend on it regardless. I would take the contrarian view. This is actually a testament of how insecure they are about the future. Because, the next bit of spectrum that will come is the incentive auction, which is right now held up in the courts.
Yeah.
Which is actually a blessing in disguise, because when you look at the list of possible candidates who will give up their spectrum, that one is quite uncertain, and there are a lot of, if you read through the tea leaves, they don't have a lot of broadcasters that will give up the spectrum in densely populated parts of the country. Every broadcaster in rural America is willing to give up their spectrum. No problem, because it's not economical to do so anymore. But if you're in New York, if you're in Chicago, if you're in LA, in Washington, doing broadcast is still quite profitable. And the case why why these broadcasters should give up the spectrum hasn't properly been made. And other than, oh, it's good for the country and the wireless carriers need it. You know, from a broadcaster's perspective, I would say, like, yeah, good for you. So, you know, the AWS spectrum is what they have right now on the table, what they can build, where they know they can have it relatively quickly. With the incentive auction, it's one shot, there is no replay, whereas with every other spectrum, they can go back and re-auction it until they get it right. This is a one-time deal, otherwise they have to go back to Congress.
Yeah.
And with how you know, and it was a minor miracle that they got this one together as part of a budget consolidation deal. And so to think that they can go back to Congress and say, oh, my bad, you know, you know, and the situation is so, you know, confrontational that I don't know if they can go back and say, oh, it was our bad, we didn't listen to you, Congress, we attached all these things, and it failed. Can we do it again? And people are like, ah, yeah, right, you know, stand in line, take a ticket, you know, we'll get to you when we get to you. Yeah. So it is spectrum that AWS3 is spectrum that they can have right now. And, you know, and oh my God, it's high, quote unquote, high frequency spectrum, you know.
Which, yeah, which is supposed to be the less valuable spectrum out there, but apparently this is showing that that's not necessarily the case.
And they just bid more than they almost bid for everything else combined, you know. So to say that high value, you know, who do you believe, the numbers or the opinions of people? Spectrum is spectrum, and for every bit of spectrum, there's a need. Low frequency spectrum is spectacular for rural parts where nobody lives, which also means that you don't make a lot of money out of it.
Yeah.
In densely populated area, you actually the network will look exactly the same if you're in 600 or in 2500 even. You actually have a little bit of less of a problem because it doesn't feed as well through the building and then interferes with somebody else because you're capacity constrained.
Yeah.
So I hope that, you know, this auction will actually, you know, show people that, you know, where it is on the spectrum dial is not that important.
Sure.
Because, you know, money talks. Yeah. People put the money where their actions are. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you look at you know, obviously the price on some of these licenses, I mean, obviously, you know, the New York City license, for instance, in this auction, the 20 megahertz there in New York City is going for, you know, $2.7 billion just for that one license, which more than 5 times what it went for in the AWS-1 auction. So it just shows that operators really do realize that that densification aspect of this spectrum is the important part of the spectrum.
And and the wider, you know, in the past, there wasn't really a premium for wider channels. Now, there is a premium for wider channels because you can do faster internet over them. You know, there wasn't really a competitive disadvantage of having 5 megahertz here, 5 megahertz there, and something else somewhere else. Now, if you have contiguous spectrum and can put one LTE channel over it, the internet speed that the consumer gets in the end is dramatically faster, you know. And yes, we will have carrier aggregation, but the dirty little secret is if you have more carriers, you will need more radios in the phone, and they will use more power because 2 radios will use double the power. So, and if it's faster, you will use it more. You know, if you use exactly the same amount of bandwidth, download bandwidth, it doesn't matter because you're downloading in half the time. So twice the battery consumption doesn't matter. But if you can fall in love with the speed, you're using it more, and then your battery will really take a hit. And so having one radio makes everything and one chunk of spectrum makes everything a lot less complex, a lot easier to manage, and a lot better for consumers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I mean, you kind of mentioned earlier the fact that to you this shows that there perhaps is some insecurity from the operators. I mean, obviously, there is that net neutrality Title II thing kind of hanging over the entire industry right now, and that does seem that no one's quite sure how that's going to play out. Though people have an idea perhaps what's going to happen there. But I guess maybe talk a bit about your feelings there. I mean, what impact that might be having on this auction. I mean, obviously, the prices are going pretty crazy. What do you think is, the correlation there between the two?
Well, I think Title II in general is an overreach. The courts have said, do Section 706. And if this ends up in the courts, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like it ends up in the courts, the government will have the high burden to say, well, we heard you on 706, but we disagree with you. And then the judge might say, well, we disagree with you, judgment for the plaintiff, and everybody looks at it and says, like, why do we have to go that way? The spectrum is here and now, and the outcome is still uncertain. So I think they need to buy the spectrum because it's a limited resource. How they then, and they will build it out according to the build-out rules. But overall, how that will impact investment and everything, is still a huge question sign. Everybody has to sharpen their pencils, has to figure out what will actually happen. But the big thing about net neutrality, when you look underneath the hood, it's actually a video thing, because with video, it's taking up all the bandwidth. That's the part of the consumption piece that we have to divvy up and make and manage to make sure that it doesn't impact you getting your email, you getting your websites, because when you look at how people use it, it's really relatively small, relatively latency independent, and now suddenly we will see video, which is very latency dependent, will probably compete with voice when they go to VoLTE. And I think that's the whole nightmare scenario that everybody is going through. And that's where they're trying to figure out what to do. But the spectrum is here. They know they will, regardless of the scenario, they know they need this more spectrum, and so they would shoot everybody in the foot by, and they're not obstinate little children that say, oh, because you threatened Title II, I will not bid on the things that I need. They're not cutting off the nose to spite the face. They have to make sure that they can do this profitably and work through all the eventualities.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I was going to ask you a bit about that because, obviously there's kind of, I guess, the legacy or whatever of the 3G auctions in Europe back in 2000, 2001 timeframe where, these operators were bidding, billions and billions of dollars on spectrum that they needed to bid on for 3G services. But at the end, it seemed like they bid so much money that a lot of these operators either couldn't do anything with it. They pretty much, spent all their money. They couldn't spend any more money on deploying these services. And at that point, it seemed like the U.S. really leaped ahead of Europe in terms of deployments. Do you see any sort of impact of this monster amount of spending for the for the spectrum impacting at all deployment plans going forward, or do you think the operators know what they're doing and obviously or have their bookkeepers there?
I don't think it will impact deployment plans because they have a build-out requirement. They have a need, especially in the larger urban markets, top 20 markets. Undoubtedly, there is a need. Contrary to what happened in Europe with the 3G auctions, where they bought the spectrum for, huge amounts, and then bungled up the marketing and how they sold 3G to consumers, and the consumers simply said, no thanks, I'm not going to buy this by the byte. I remember I worked for a European research company then, and our IT people said we shouldn't use the laptop cards to download unnecessary things like PowerPoint presentations wirelessly, because that would be a terrible waste. I don't think we have a fear that consumers will not show up and use the spectrum in this country. So that there is a monetization that will come in. It's and that will pay for that all. So we have that, and the carriers are profitable in this country despite the procrastinations of a price war. If the weak operator, the quote unquote weak operator, if the sick men in the industry make a 25% EBITDA profitability, we still have a reasonably healthy industry. It's where you have a lot of leeway, where you can deploy a lot of money for bringing the services to people.
Yeah, good point. And obviously, too, I think with this spectrum, again, we don't know who's buying what because the names aren't released yet. But if the names that we expect are buying these licenses, they already are using the 1.7 and 2.1 band anyway. So just adding more spectrum to a tower should not be a huge investment for the most part. It should be maybe some radio retuning. Obviously, devices need to be compatible, but it's not going to be a huge greenfield type of build for these guys. They're going to be pretty much just adding some more spectrum, and it should be fairly easy to do.
Correct. There shouldn't be a big investment. The antennas can do it, so there's no need to change anything on the tower. And they probably have to change things on the base stations, maybe only insert a channel card, and that's it. So the upgrade, if they are just replicating their existing coverage, is going to be fine. And then if they are expanding coverage, they would expand it for the whole AWS band anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, you talked a little bit earlier kind of about the fact that this will impact, it seems, or perhaps impact the incentive auction. Now, like you said, I mean, in rural areas, that low band spectrum is pretty valuable, but not as much so in the more dense markets. This is almost setting up a scenario where the incentive auction, when it does actually happen in 2016, whenever that is, will almost seem like it could be perhaps a rural market auction as opposed to a broad nationwide auction. I mean, obviously, the spectrum is always valuable, but depending on what happens, it could be more valuable for companies trying to get better rural coverage, perhaps like a T-Mobile or someone like that who doesn't have that low band spectrum.
Well, I hear now, with this coming up at 45 billion, the expectation that because low band spectrum is so much more valuable, that they would get 80, 90 billion dollars, which, every time we make this forecast, it goes actually higher. But I think, industry revenue is 180 billion dollars. That would be half industry revenue. I don't think there's that much money available. So I don't think we will see a significant increase in the per megahertz pop prices for low band spectrum. I think there will be still predominantly buyers for the incentive auction spectrum in urban markets if there's actually spectrum available. Because if we look at the broadcast television business model, it is quite healthy in urban markets. So the FCC's problems in the courts is actually a blessing in disguise because it gives them the opportunity to convince more broadcasters in large markets to come on board. Because in rural markets, broadcast is dead. All of the broadcasters in smaller markets are ready to sell this. The question is, do we actually need it? Because when we look at the statistics, it shows in rural America, we have 2 or 3 carriers operating, because that's all that the competition and then the number of people in these markets allows to support. Um, and so the amount of spectrum available, it's the same amount of spectrum in an urban market. You just divide it by less players. And so there's already quite an enviable spectrum position. Adding more spectrum to there will not change that. So in urban markets, it will get bought. In rural markets, yeah, T-Mobile might buy it. Some of the rural carriers might buy it, but it's quite a challenging business model to get back into wireless because a lot of the rural players have exited, and not for economic reasons necessarily, but a lot of it because the owners of these operators, a lot of them small mom and pop wireline carriers, are in their 50s, early 60s, looking to retire with more money than they ever thought they would make, without an heir really in sight that wants or can carry on the torch. But for a new carrier to come in, you're looking at payback periods of somewhere between 7 and 20 years. I don't know how many people, and then you don't know what happens. You have to invest to be a greenfield operator for anybody, even Sprint, T-Mobile, even if you have it somewhere else in a market, is a really tough, long, battle with a lot of uncertainty. So I don't think there will be that much.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to watch that part. Yeah, but again, the FCC has so many more challenges with that auction that we'll see what happens at some point with that one. But I guess getting back to the one that's almost wrapping up here, I mean, again, we're to the point now where just a handful of new bids in each round. I guess we know some of the players in the auction. We don't know what they're doing in the auction per se because of the rules of the auction. But if you were to take a guess, looking at the numbers being thrown around, I mean, it would seem that the big players are indeed throwing around the biggest money in this auction. I mean, I'm guessing that in these larger markets, that the Verizons, AT&Ts, T-Mobiles, maybe even the Dishes of the world are probably involved in some of these auctions and some of this bidding. If you were to take a look forward, again, we'll see the names eventually here, but what's your general view of what's happening perhaps in this auction?
Well, I think AT&T and Verizon will be the two biggest bidders. They have already a large installed base that can actually benefit from the international roaming capabilities that will come when they get put in the phones, and they need more the spectrum than anybody else, because if you look at it, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile have basically the same amount of spectrum, and twice the customers that T-Mobile or Sprint has, and Sprint, who didn't participate, has more than double the spectrum that the other three have.
Yeah.
I think T-Mobile wanting to get more into this and also needing more spec, at least in the medium run, will get into it. I think Dish will certainly be in the mix, and I think that will be the carriers like in the top 20 markets. When we get outside the top 20, probably more like 30, 40, 50, I think we will see quite a few of the financial investors who have shown up in huge numbers. And, these are the important but not critical markets that the large operators need.
Yeah.
You need New York, you need Chicago, you need the Bay Area, you need LA, and you're not going to wait around. But for Madison, Wisconsin, 50th largest market, if a financial investor or a designated entity comes in, buys it, operates it for 5 years, and then sells, that's the right timing. Because 5 years, we have more money, let's focus on the big markets that really move the needle. The smaller markets, we can buy in secondary market transactions. Yeah. I think that's what's happened. and that is actually buoying the price as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tim. And obviously, I think we always look back to the PCS auctions again when a company like NextWave, for instance, came in and they bought a bunch of licenses and promised a bunch of money, but it seemed looking back on that now that they really had no interest ever of really building out these markets. They were just pretty much looking to flip those licenses at some point. Again, some of these financial guys who are coming in now, that's basically what their business model is, to buy these licenses, again, meet the minimum build-out requirements, whatever it takes for the SEC to keep them happy. And then at some point, just look for the big guys to come in and pick out for licenses for the profit.
A website that lets you sell the service, so that you're actually providing it to consumers. Go through the minimum motions and then sell it. That's the logical thing. It's we have to recognize the mobile industry is so capital intensive. It is extremely difficult to get in and succeed. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult. It's one of the most competitive markets in the world, if not the most competitive market. And they're going through price cuts, and which hurts a new entrant a lot more than it hurts the big guys. And we applaud them for being competitors, for providing consumers the best deal, but it also removes that cushion that a new entrant could use to get in there. And we have to remember, the smallest of the big four carriers has 50 million customers. It's a $20 billion company. That's a small guy. It's a big industry, but I think I'm not afraid for the small carriers that are still around and that want to fight, because I always say they're on a bicycle running around a steamroller. They're much closer to their customer. They can be a lot more flexible. They can provide the things that people in especially rural parts want. But if you get run over by a steamroller on a bicycle, you've done something wrong. You've slowed down, you've given away that competitive edge that you have. And at the same time, you see over and over again the larger carriers actually helping out the little guys. Verizon, for example, has that whole spectrum deal with them. Yeah. Right now, T-Mobile and Sprint, or at least before this auction, were working with a lot of smaller operators and investors building out the rural parts of what they own. So there are niches, there are opportunities even for the little guys, but you have to work for your money. It's not like otherwise, the whole thing, like with MVNOs, happens all over again, where there were so many people coming in saying, I'll be an MVNO because these wireless carriers have no idea on how to run a business, and I'm going to beat them. Well, it didn't work out like that. The only one around that really matters of size is TracFone. And TracFone runs an extremely tight ship. They question every expense, and only now, after hitting 25 million customers, you see them on television with Straight Talk, whereas beforehand every little guy thought, like, I can afford television, well, that's your kiss of death as a little guy, but
Yeah, it's been interesting, Mario. But you're right, though. It is a huge industry to get into, and like you said, there is a lot of money needed to get in there. And the price cuts are making it more difficult. So, well, it'll be interesting to see. Well, again, hey, Roger, we definitely appreciate the insight today. Obviously, once this auction wraps up, the SEC will release the names of who's actually participating, and I'm guessing that'll be hopefully less than a week afterwards, hopefully quicker than that. But perhaps at some point there we can catch up again and see actually what happened and see the damage that happened in some of these licenses. But we'll catch up
again. And the opportunities, and who got what, and how that impacts their spectrum position. So it'll be very exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Especially, and again, like we were saying, I mean, the mobile data market is not slowing down. I mean, these carriers need this spectrum. And
Yeah.
so whatever they get in this auction is going to impact their ability to market services over the next 12 months. I mean, if they can't get enough spectrum, they need to kind of maybe tune down or refarm or do something else to get spectrum. So it's going to impact what they do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Roger. Again, appreciate the time today. Thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
All right.